We're going in 3, 2, 1.
Yo, what is up, everyone? Tay here. And we have a lot to talk about today regarding some new leaks and reports for Fantastic Four First Steps and Avengers Doomsday, specifically getting into the trippy realm of black holes and what that will mean for the final battle of Avengers Doomsday, the MCU's version of Battleworld, all that stuff. Now, before I go any further, I should note that there is going to be some spoilers in today's video regarding a few details for Fantastic Four First Steps. So fair warning on that if you don't want to know any Fantastic Four spoilers. And we do have a bunch of great super thanks questions to get to at the end of today's video regarding some other Fantastic Four and Avengers stuff. So make sure you watch until the end for those. And to those of you watching, remember that if you would like to leave a super thanks with a question or a comment on today's video, that those really help out the channel a lot, and that I will read and respond to those in the next video. So yeah, I think that covers it. Subscribe to the channel if you are new here and a fan of Marvel and the MCU, and let's jump into it.
Whatever life throws at us, we'll face it together.
Johnny, now!
As a family.
All right, so about 2 weeks ago, Marvel Studios showed an exclusive clip from Fantastic Four First Steps at CCXP. And based on the description from those in attendance, this clip was an action space sequence where we see Shalla chasing the Fantastic Four's ship, the Excelsior, through space as Sue Storm is going into labor. And it says that Shalla is specifically chasing the Fantastic Four because she is trying to get to Sue so that she can take her and her baby, Franklin, back to Galactus, because Galactus wants to use Franklin Richards' reality warping powers to recreate his old universe. And apparently what happens is while Reed is attending to Sue, Ben and Johnny are the ones who are piloting the ship. And in order to escape from Shalla, Reed tells Ben to fly into a nearby black hole. And while Ben disagrees and says that it's too dangerous, Reed tells him to just trust him and to just do it, and that is apparently where the scene ends. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is this whole black holes thing and what it will mean for the projects we have coming up in Phase 6. Because for a few years now, there's been several different rumors and scoops saying that the concept of black holes would end up playing an important role in the culmination of the multiverse saga. And as I'm sure many of you remember, black holes were referenced a lot in both seasons of Loki, with there even being a big Easter egg in the Season 2 credits for the book Black Holes, The End of the Universe. And it wasn't actually just Loki. There have also been references to black holes in the What If show, as well as during the Incursions scene at the end of the Marvels. Because during this scene in the Marvels, when Dar-Ben uses the quantum bands to start this incursion, when this rift opens up in space, at first we see what appears to be a wormhole. But if you look close, you can actually see that there is a black hole at the center of this wormhole, which then after a few moments suddenly breaks open to show the Earth of this other universe, which we now know is the X-Men universe that we will return to in Avengers Doomsday. And if we go back to last year, there were actually some early plot leaks that dropped for Fantastic Four First Steps that claimed to be based on an earlier version of the script. And those older leaks actually described a scene from the Fantastic Four that sounds very similar to the one they just showed at CCXP, where the team is being chased by Shalla and ends up flying into a black hole to escape. And according to those old leaks, what happens after the team flies through this black hole is the Fantastic Four end up in a different universe that might end up being revealed as the MCU 616 universe, but that they don't stay in this universe for too long because they have to go back to their universe so that they can protect their world from Galactus. But I just bring this up because based on everything we've heard so far regarding black holes in these different MCU projects of the multiverse saga, it sounds like the Fantastic Four movie could end up confirming that black holes are the key to multiversal travel, and that this could end up being how the Fantastic Four will eventually enter the MCU 616 universe at the beginning of Avengers Doomsday. So now we're going to move on and talk about the specific details of how black holes could play a very important role in everything we're going to see happen in Avengers Doomsday and Phase 6 in general, and how that could tie into Battleworld and the final battle of Avengers Doomsday, and also everything that we're going to see happen in Avengers Secret Wars.
So what are we looking at? Self-propagating singularity with negative mass and non-Newtonian topology. She tore a hole in space-time.
All right. So recently, there's been several new reports stating that the Void is going to end up being a very important location in both Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. And when these new reports came out, this was not surprising to me because ever since the Void was first introduced back in Loki Season 1, I've been theorizing on how the Void would be the perfect location to become the MCU's version of Battleworld. And of course, naturally, since then, a lot of other people have come to this same conclusion because this is a theory that just makes a lot of sense. Because with Battleworld being the central location of both versions of the Secret Wars comics, there's just no way, in my opinion, that it won't also become a central location for the Secret Wars movie. There's no way they can do the Secret Wars movie without some kind of version of Battleworld. In fact, Marvel Comics just barely announced a new Battleworld comic series that is set to release in September. And this isn't a huge deal, but we do know that Marvel Comics has become more and more interlinked with what is happening in the MCU, so the fact that we are now getting this new Battleworld comic series definitely makes me feel like they are doing this because of the likelihood that we will see Battleworld in the upcoming Avengers movies and in Avengers Secret Wars. And as we know, what the Void is it's a patchwork reality that has been created from all of the different multiversal realities that have been pruned by the TVA. And that concept of it being a patchwork of multiversal realities all smashed together is basically the exact same concept of what Battleworld was in the comics. So instead of the Russo brothers using precious story time in order to set up and explain how a new version of Battleworld will be created, I think it just makes sense for them to use the Void because it is a location that fans already know and that's already been established. And in some of the past leaks we've seen come out over the past few months, we've heard details that the final battle of Avengers Doomsday will occur at the TVA, and that it will ultimately converge with Doctor Doom coming for Loki and his throne at the end of time. However, based on some of these new leaks and these newer reports, it sounds like the Void could also end up being one of those locations where the final battle could occur. And again, I think that makes sense because Marvel Studios have never really fully explained and mapped out how closely the TVA headquarters, the Void, and the End of Time are all connected. But we do know that they all exist outside of the multiverse, and that the Void also exists at the End of Time in a realm that is directly adjacent to the Citadel at the End of Time. So maybe what we could see happen during the final battle for Avengers Doomsday is that this battle could end up starting out at the TVA headquarters, but from there it could end up spilling over into the Void, and then at the end, it will ultimately converge with Doom coming for Loki at the Citadel at the End of Time. And based on other things that have also been mentioned in these more recent leaks, it sounds like that besides Doctor Doom and Loki, some of the other characters that will reportedly also be involved during this final battle will be Sam, Thor, Bob, Bucky, Yelena, Ant-Man, Captain Marvel, Namor, Shuri, and Shang-Chi, along with several of the X-Men from the universe we saw at the end of the Marvels. And those are just the characters that are mentioned to be involved, but there will likely be several others during the final battle as well, because we've also heard reports that the TVA will also have assembled their own multiversal Avengers team to help protect Loki, and that this team could include characters like Deadpool and Wolverine, along with several other multiversal heroes who have yet to be confirmed. But going back to the Void and the role it will play, just because I think that the Void could be used as a stand-in for Battleworld, that doesn't mean that I think it will be portrayed in the exact same way as Battleworld was in the comics, because I think in the end it'll probably end up being a bit more complicated than that, and that the Russo brothers will want to switch things up in the story a little bit so that the movies aren't exact adaptations of the comics. Because as I've discussed before, it seems like what Doctor Doom's overall plan will be in Avengers Doomsday is that he will ultimately be trying to get to Loki at the end of time so that he can usurp his throne and use it to take over the multiverse, and that Avengers Doomsday could end with Doctor Doom winning and the multiverse being destroyed. And the thing is that even if the multiverse is destroyed, we know that the one place that will still exist is the Void and the end of time. So one possibility for what could happen in Doomsday and Secret Wars is that maybe at the end of Avengers Doomsday, Doctor Doom will destroy the multiverse, and he could then go on to just rule over the Void, basically the same way that he ruled over Battleworld in the comics. Because that really would be very, very similar to how things went down in Hickman's 2015 Secret Wars story. But like I just said, I really don't think that the Russo brothers are going to want to do a exact adaptation of what happened in the comics. So even though something like that could happen, I don't think that is what's going to happen. Because you have to remember that in the MCU, the Void is known as a metaphysical trash heap. I mean, it's literally the dumping grounds of the multiverse.
You're in the Void. Think of it as purgatory. Reed called it a metaphysical junkyard.
And I really doubt that Doctor Doom's big plan will simply be to rule over the trash heap of the multiverse after the multiverse is destroyed. Plus, I mean, another thing that's a big factor in all of this that I haven't mentioned yet is Franklin Richards. Because at this point, it's basically been confirmed that in Fantastic Four First Steps, it will be revealed that Franklin will have the same reality warping abilities that he had in the comics, which means that he will literally have the powers to construct entirely new universes. And recently, Marvel Studios held an early screening for Fantastic Four First Steps in LA. And of course, with that screening, some big spoilers ended up leaking online, including details for the big post-credit scene. And according to those leaks, what ends up happening in that post-credit scene is we see Sue Storm reading a bedtime story to young Franklin Richards. But then she ends up getting up for some reason to leave the room for a moment, and when she returns, she finds Doctor Doom in the bedroom sitting next to Franklin. And apparently that's it. That's where it cuts out. And if this post-credits leak is accurate, then this would seem to confirm some of the other theories that I've discussed in past videos. Because what I've said I think could happen in Avengers Doomsday is that Doctor Doom will end up taking Franklin Richards to raise him as his own son so that he can use his reality warping abilities as a part of his big grand plan to take over the multiverse. So I think what we might see happen at the end of Avengers Doomsday is that Doctor Doom and his forces will fight their way through the TVA and eventually get to Loki at the end of time, and after a big battle, Loki will be defeated and Doom will take his place as the god of the multiverse. And then once that is achieved, that Doctor Doom could use that position to either prune or destroy the multiverse, and then Doom could use Franklin to create a new singular universe for him to rule over as its god. And there's actually been some rumors saying that what Doctor Doom wants to do is he wants to recreate his home universe that was destroyed by an incursion at some point in the past. But either way, regardless of whether it's Doctor Doom's old universe or an entirely new universe, the bigger point is that Doom's end goal could end up being to destroy the multiverse and replace it with just one singular universe, because if there's only one universe left in existence, then those big multiversal threats like the Incursions or the Council of Kangs would no longer be a factor, and Doctor Doom would truly be left as the most powerful force in reality. However, If this is accurate and something like this is what happens and Doom does end up destroying the multiverse, then like I said, the Void and the End of Time will still exist because they exist outside of the multiverse. So, with these new reports coming out about the Void being a very important location in the upcoming Avengers films, then if this is what happens, then this would still leave the question of what role will the Void play? Well, I think it's possible that the Void could basically end up becoming like Doctor Doom's own multiversal prison planet, and that maybe that is how it will go on to play a big role similar to Battleworld in Avengers Secret Wars. Which, if something like this did happen, then this could mean that the events of the Secret Wars movie won't just occur in one location like it did in the comics, but that there could actually be two major locations, with one being the Void and the other being the Earth of Doom's new universe. And the last time we saw the Void in Deadpool and Wolverine, it was still fairly desolate with these different factions of characters floating around. But depending on what the Russo brothers have planned for Avengers Doomsday, it would be very easy for them to turn the Void from a desolate wasteland into an entire civilization full of kingdoms, cities, and characters from throughout the multiverse, basically just like what Battleworld was in the comics. You know, that maybe in Avengers Doomsday something could happen to where instead of the heroes and villains of the multiverse just being destroyed by the Incursions or the multiversal war, that maybe somehow those characters could instead end up being pruned and sent to the Void, thus making the Void much more crowded and busy and very similar to what Battleworld was in the comics. Now, I'm not sure exactly how the Russo brothers would do that, but there's definitely a lot of different ways they could make that happen. The key is just writing something into the Doomsday script to where a lot of different characters end up getting pruned. So, for example, maybe one way this could happen is that instead of Doctor Doom simply destroying the multiverse, maybe he could prune the multiverse, or at least prune a large chunk of it, using some kind of TVA technology similar to the Time Ripper that we saw in Deadpool and Wolverine. Or another possibility is that maybe instead of Doom doing a mass pruning event, maybe it could instead be the TVA. You know, like maybe by the time we get to the end of Avengers Doomsday, the Incursions might have already wiped out most of the multiverse. So as a last resort to save the few remaining universes left in existence, the TVA could prune those realities and send them to the Void, because at least then they would still have some kind of fighting chance at survival. Or, you know, something like that. Because again, those are just examples of hypothetical what-ifs of different ways the Russo brothers could do that. But the point is that all the Russo brothers have to do if they want to populate the Void and turn it into Battleworld is to write in some kind of mass pruning event into the plot of Avengers Doomsday, and that's all it would take to turn the Void into something like Battleworld for the Secret Wars movie. Which, something we've talked about before, is how we might have already seen a small glimpse at what Battleworld could potentially look like in the upcoming Avengers films. Because there was that Avengers concept art that was prematurely posted online a couple of months ago that showed what appeared to be the MCU's version of Battleworld. Now, we can't know for sure that this was meant to be the Void, but this art definitely showed us an example of the crazy kingdoms and locations that could exist in the Void as a version of Battleworld once we get to the Secret Wars movie. And it's not just the Void that will likely end up being a central location in Doomsday and Secret Wars, it's also the throne at the end of time. And we know that the throne at the end of time exists on a meteor out in space in a realm directly adjacent to the Void. And when we saw this location in Loki Season 1, we saw that the Citadel at the end of time stood there. However, when we saw the end of time again during the finale of Loki Season 2, the Citadel had crumbled and was no longer there, and all that was left was the throne. And something I've theorized on in the past is that when we see Loki on this meteor at the end of time in Avengers Doomsday, that it's not going to just be an empty chair sitting on a meteor anymore, that something's going to have to be built there, similar to how the Citadel was there during the first season of Loki. And what I've theorized is that with Loki now being the god of stories, that he could have used his magic to construct the Library of Worlds where the Citadel once stood. However, if Doctor Doom ends up defeating Loki at the end of Doomsday and takes over his throne, then my other theory is that once we get to Avengers Secret Wars, that maybe what we could see is that Doctor Doom has now constructed a new version of Castle Doom where the Citadel once stood, very similar to his version of Castle Doom in Battleworld from the comics. Because again, with Doctor Doom being the villain of these upcoming Avengers movies, I feel like that's just another thing that we have to see. We have to see some kind of version of Castle Doom. And if something like this is what happens, then this could perhaps be how it ties together both the Void and the Earth of Doom's new universe, because Doom could use his throne at the end of time to watch over both locations. You know, he could be ruling over this new universe he's created, and he could also be ruling over the Void. And what happened in Hickman's Secret Wars comic is a small group of heroes were able to survive the final incursions using Reed Richards' life raft that carried them to Battleworld, where they woke up 8 years later. And what happened is once these surviving heroes woke up, they traveled across Battleworld and assembled a resistance army to march on Castle Doom so that they could defeat Doom and then use his Beyonder powers to reset the multiverse back to the way it was before. And I think that is probably very similar to the plot we could see in the Secret Wars movie. That maybe what could happen is in Avengers Doomsday is that a lot of characters will end up dying, and some of them could also end up being pruned and sent to the Void, but that a small group of heroes could end up surviving the events of Doomsday, and that once we get to Avengers Secret Wars, that small group of survivors will have to travel to the Void and assemble an army of multiversal characters to come together and form a resistance to go and defeat Doctor Doom. And I think that this is possibly where black holes could come back into the picture. Because if we go back to Loki Season 1, during the opening of the season finale, we saw this really cool cosmic sequence that appeared to basically be this multi-dimensional map that goes from Earth 616 all the way to the Citadel at the end of time. Because if we go back and look at what happened during this opening scene, it starts off with Earth of the MCU 616 universe, and then quickly travels backwards through the cosmos, showing the Milky Way galaxy, and eventually backing out from one black hole, and then quickly zooming forward into another black hole that appears to take us into an entirely different universe that ends with this meteor out in space where the Citadel is located at the end of time. And I always felt like this sequence held some hidden significance that would be important at some point later in the multiverse saga. And after hearing about the Fantastic Four clip that was shown at CCXP, where the team flies into a black hole to escape from Shah Bal, I'm starting to think that this sequence that we saw in Loki Season 1 could come back around and be important during Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. Because if something happens at the end of Doomsday with Doctor Doom or the Incursions that is threatening the multiverse, then maybe what we could see happen is we could see a small group of heroes taking this same route and flying a ship into this same black hole and using it to make their way to the Void, just like the survivors on the life raft in the Secret Wars comic and how they used it to escape the final incursion and fly to Battleworld. And again, this might not be exactly how things happen, but it could end up being something close to this, to where black holes won't just be the key to multiversal travel, but they could also be the key to how characters could make their way to the Void or to the end of time. However, if you remember what happened in Loki Season 2, you might be asking, well, what about the spaghettification factor? Because in Loki Season 2, we learned all about spaghettification and how this is what happens to a person or an object when they are exposed to the gravitational field of a black hole. So with that in mind, the question then becomes, how could anyone survive flying through a black hole in the first place? Well, they actually addressed this exact problem in the Marvel animated series Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, where they explained that if a ship flies through a black hole at a fast enough speed, that you can bypass the effects of the gravitational field and use a black hole to travel from one universe to another. And even though this show isn't technically a part of the MCU, I do think that the way that the show explains the physics behind black holes and how black holes can be used for multiversal travel will probably end up being very close to the explanation that we'll hear in Fantastic Four First Steps and the upcoming Avengers films. Because one thing about Marvel Studios is that they are very good about finding these different quantum physicists and astrophysicists to come in and help them with their movies so that they get the science right behind these big ideas around the cosmos and time travel and the multiverse. So yeah, I've kind of gone through the different ways of how black holes could factor into the upcoming Avengers movies in regards to Battleworld or multiversal travel, all that stuff. However, another way that black holes could also tie into the plot of Avengers Doomsday and Secret Wars is that a black hole could be what is technically happening when an incursion destroys two universes. You know, that a black hole could be what is caused when an incursion occurs. Because like I mentioned earlier, we know from Loki Season 2 that a black hole causes the spaghettification of reality. And if we go back to the Sinister Strange universe, you know, the Incursion universe that Doctor Strange visited in Multiverse of Madness, when Doctor Strange was inside Sinister Strange's sanctum, outside of the window, we could see what appeared to be this giant rift in space that was slowly pulling in all of the mass of this world. And while this effect didn't look exactly the same as the spaghettification effect that we saw in Loki, it was still very similar. And we actually also saw something similar to that in the Doctor Strange episode of What If Season 1, when Strange Supreme's universe was collapsing, and again, we see this very similar inky kind of spaghetti effect. So maybe when we get to Avengers Doomsday, it could be explained that when an incursion does occur in the MCU, that what is actually happening when these two universes collide is that it creates a singularity of some kind that then causes a black hole to slowly devour the mass of both realities. Because, I mean, that's basically what we saw at the end of Loki Season 2 when Loki repeatedly failed to fix the loom. You know, the loom would eventually fail, causing a giant singularity to occur that would spaghettify and pull apart reality. So yeah, if the different reports and rumors we've heard about black holes being very important in the multiverse saga are true, then these are all the different ways of how black holes could be important. And, you know, I'm not going to pretend to understand the complex physics behind black holes and all that, because that is definitely not my strong suit. But, you know, based on what we've seen so far in the MCU, this all seems like it would make sense to me. That how black holes could figure into these different Phase 6 projects and tie into the upcoming Avengers movies is that they could be the key to multiversal travel and could play a big role in how certain heroes could travel to the void or the end of time or just travel between universes, but that they could also explain the inner workings of what actually takes place when an incursion occurs and how an incursion actually destroys a reality. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Please leave a like and share the video if you did, but don't go anywhere just yet because I still have a bunch of really good super thanks questions to respond to regarding a bunch of other stuff with the Avengers movies and Phase 6 and all that. So don't go anywhere and let's get to those.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's jump into these super thanks. And first, we have two $5 ones from my guy, Gator Chris, and also a $5 one from Blackfire Warrior. So thank you very much to both of you guys. I appreciate it as always. Then we also have 5 from my dude, Jeffrey. And this one says, "Hi, Tay. Hope you're doing well, buddy. Really like this vid. I agree with you that Doctor Strange 3 would be the best fit for that slot in between the Avengers movies. I also feel that the gap between Fantastic Four and Avengers Doomsday is too big. Perhaps they'll do a feature film of some kind on Disney+, perhaps Midnight Suns or a Defenders feature film, maybe even the Champions linked up with the Vision Quest stuff. By the way, have you been watching Mobland? Cheers, bro. Take care and thanks." And first off, I did watch Mobland, and I thought it was good. I just wish, it had better character development because all the characters in it are very unlikable. And I just feel like with Guy Ritchie, if you watch his other movies like Rock'n'Rolla, Snatch, and The Gentleman, my favorites, they have such amazing character development and such charming, likable characters, even though they're gangsters. And if you watch Mobland, it's all very dry, there's not much levity to it. And yeah, even though the show is about these gangsters that do this horrible stuff, you can still make some of them at least a little bit charming or likable. So yeah, I thought the show was good, but it's nowhere near as good as his movies like The Gentleman or Snatch. And then as far as what you're saying about there maybe being a Disney Plus movie released between Fantastic Four and Avengers Doomsday, unfortunately, I think that's very unlikely. And if they did release a movie in between those projects, I definitely think it would be a theatrical movie. And with Midnight Suns and Champions, I do think those are definitely two projects that are in early development, but likely won't come out until after the multiverse saga is over. So yeah, I still have hope for Doctor Strange 3 coming out between the Avengers films. And like I talked about in that last video, I do think there's a small possibility that they could try to fast track some other film to come out in between those, but it's not super likely in my opinion. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Jeffrey. And then the next one we have is 10 from Nick Standridge 528. And this one says, do you think a vibranium Iron Man suit could have saved Tony from the snap? I think it would, and I'm just wondering your opinion on this theory, even though it would change the trajectory of the whole MCU. Just curious. All right, thanks, Nick. And yeah, it's funny you asked this because I actually did at least one theory video about that years ago in the lead up to Avengers Endgame because, you know, they made such a big deal about the Infinity Gauntlet being made of Uru metal in Avengers Infinity War. And I knew that Tony Stark and the Avengers were likely going to create their own gauntlet in Avengers Endgame. And one of the theories that I had was that it would be made out of vibranium because that's another metal that could handle the energy of the Infinity Stones. Now, even if it would have been vibranium, I don't think it would have necessarily saved Tony because even Thanos' Uru metal Infinity Gauntlet still almost took him out. But yeah, I still think it would have been cool if it would have been made out of vibranium, just to explain why it could hold the stones. So yeah, thanks for that, Nick. But anyways, then moving on, the next one we have is 5 from Joel Lahuan 4159. I'm probably saying that wrong, but sorry about that, Joel. And this one says, great video, Tay. Love how you do your research and bring out so much content for us to discuss with all of our nerdy friends. Had a question about Thor. It was recently said that Chris Hemsworth released a farewell video for his role as Thor. I was recently watching Spider-Man Homecoming and Happy Hogan talked about the Megan-Yord. Will this be something we will see in Doomsday or Secret Wars, and how will this affect the role? Thanks, and keep the videos coming, bro. Well, this is a fun question because I haven't thought about the Megan-Yord in years, and I'm sure those of you watching probably haven't either. And for those of you who don't remember, the Megan-Yord is one of Thor's magical belts from the comics that when he wears it, it increases his power. And it was referenced back in Spider-Man Homecoming as one of the relics that was at Avengers Tower when Tony put Happy in charge of moving everything out of the tower. Now, it was a big Easter egg at the time, but nothing ever came of it. So while I'm not necessarily expecting it to come back around in the upcoming Avengers movies, like it's not something I think Marvel Studios are sitting there going, oh, we got to figure out how to get that in there because we mentioned it all the way back in Homecoming. But at the same time, I also wouldn't be surprised if they brought it back because we know that Thor is going to need all the power he can muster to defeat Doctor Doom, or try to defeat Doctor Doom. So yeah, to answer your question, I have no idea if they will bring the Megan-Yord back for the upcoming Avengers films, but I think it would be pretty cool if they did. So yeah, that was a fun one. And then the last one we have is $14 from Elite Echo 11. And this one says, hey Tay, been tuning in for almost 7 years and you never disappoint. This vid is perfect for what I've been wanting to ask you. I feel that without there being any more projects that we know of that focus on main or secondary characters who could be a part of Doomsday or Secret Wars, that it will be hard to be invested in these characters on the new team. I mean, we haven't heard from some of them in so freaking long, such as Hawkeye, Ant-Man Wasp, Moon Knight, Dane Whitman, Shuri, Wanda, Vision, Thor, The Guardians, Annihilators, Cap, Marvel, Wong, all of which you would expect to be players in Doomsday. Even worse, they sidelined so many films like Shang-Chi 2, Doctor Strange 3, Thor 5, Eternals 2, Spider-Man 4, Armor Wars, and a Young Avengers project, and instead they think it's a good idea to release projects like Ironheart and Wonder Man. Like, come on. And like you've said, the Russos are who we as fans probably trust the most to pull this off, but they can only do so much. My point is it feels like everything is so disconnected and they are focusing on the wrong characters right now, whereas building up to Infinity War, we knew exactly where our heroes would come into play, and that's what made the road to the culmination event even better. But I'm worried that Doomsday will just feel so disjointed because the setup right now doesn't look good. I mean, there's barely any crossover of characters in the past few films, minus the Thunderbolts post-credit scene, and so many loose threads. Anyways, apologies this is so long, but thanks again for all your hard work and keeping us entertained. Alright, thanks dude, appreciate that. And as far as the projects you're talking about, like Wonder Man and Ironheart, those are projects that were greenlit years ago before Marvel Studios did their whole revamp, so I think that's why those are coming out right now, even though they might not seem to fit in as much. I think the projects that Marvel Studios will develop in the next saga will definitely have more thought put into them. But the thing you have to remember about Doomsday and Secret Wars is that the core plot of those movies aren't necessarily going to be about the Avengers team, because these are going to be giant culmination event films that are more going to be about bringing together all of the main MCU characters for one big event, the same way that Infinity War and Endgame were culmination events for the Infinity Saga. And one of the areas where I think that Marvel Studios made an error with the Multiverse Saga was by not doing a smaller Avengers movie that did just focus on the Avengers team. Because if they had made a smaller Avengers film, kind of similar to like Age of Ultron, that just focused on Sam bringing together his new Avengers team at some point in Phase 5, I think that would have made a huge difference for the saga and made it feel a lot more cohesive. So I think what the Russo brothers are going to do with Doomsday and Secret Wars is that they are going to give the majority of the bigger roles to characters that were around back during the Infinity Saga, with characters like Sam, Thor, Loki, Carol, Wanda, Bucky, Peter Parker, Doctor Strange, characters like that, because those are all characters that have been around long enough to be well developed, and they are also characters that have had their own projects so far in the Multiverse Saga. But then some of the newer characters like Shang-Chi, Miss Marvel, Namor, John Walker, newer characters that were just introduced during the Multiverse Saga, I think that the characters like that are most likely going to have smaller supporting roles instead of being big leading characters. So with those characters having those smaller supporting roles, it won't be as important for the movie to tie back to the plots of their past projects. However, that said, there are still a handful of newer characters that I think will probably have pretty big roles, like Reed Richards and Sue Storm, because I think that with everything that is going to be happening with Franklin Richards and Doctor Doom, that the Fantastic Four are going to be very important characters in the plot of the Avengers films. And then besides that, another character that I think will probably have a pretty big role is also Yelena, because she is one of the leaders of the new Avengers team, and also just because Yelena has become a very popular character. And the Russo brothers have said in recent interviews that they do have a plan to tie together the more important elements of the Multiverse Saga into one cohesive story for these Avengers movies. But I do think it's important for fans to not expect these Avengers movies to tie together everything that's happened in the Multiverse Saga. So the past projects that I do think will tie into the plot of Doomsday and Secret Wars are most likely going to be Loki, No Way Home, Multiverse of Madness, The Marvels, Deadpool and Wolverine, and Fantastic Four First Steps. So basically all of the projects that actually had something to do with the multiverse, those will be the ones that will be the most important in setting up the plot for Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. So thank you very much for that, Elite Echo, and thank you to the rest of you, Chris, Warrior, Jeffrey, all of you others. Thank you very much for the super thanks. I appreciate it. And to those of you watching, remember that if you would like to leave a super thanks with a question or a comment in this video, that those really help out the channel a lot, and that I will read and respond to those in the next video. So yeah, let's wrap this thing up. Keep an eye out for another video to come out in the next few days that I am working on. And if you missed any of the other recent videos, you can find those linked in the description down below. And of course, if you are new to the channel and a fan of Marvel and the MCU, then you should definitely subscribe, because that is what we talk about here. All right, cool. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and I will be back in a few days with the next one.